Hello, I'm Robert, a voluntary fact checker and helping you if you're scared of many things. So this is about if anyone who's worrying because Biden has permitted Ukraine to fire shells back over the Russian border when it's attacked. Nothing's going to happen, and I'm going to explain why and I'll go into some detail. So first of all, what's happened is that Biden has permitted to let Ukraine fire shells over the border in the Kharkiv Oblast. It's just restricted to the Kharkiv Oblast at present. And that if Russia is firing shells at Ukraine, then Ukraine is permitted to fire back at Russia. That's all he's basically allowed them to do so far. Or if they're preparing to fire shells at Ukraine. And Putin is not going to do anything because that's why we keep saying they're bluffs. They're bluffs because he says he'll do this or he says he'll do that. In this case, he just vaguely said he'd escalate. And then when NATO countries cross that red line, he does nothing typically. So the two responses, in fact. First response, the first of his red lines after the war started was when NATO countries or European countries, I can't remember who it was, said they'd sanction Russia. And Putin said vaguely that if they sanction him, then he'll escalate or he'll do something vague, and it sounded like he meant to use nukes. And of course they did sanction Russia, and Russia did nothing. Another example of that very similar kind of thing, he didn't even talk about it after that. And another example like that is when Finland and Sweden said that they were going to decide to join NATO, and Putin said, if you join NATO, then he's made some vague threat. I can't remember the details, but it was serious sounding enough so that UK said to Sweden, we will protect you with our nuclear umbrella before you join NATO during the transition so that you can feel safe from Putin. And then eventually Sweden and Finland joined NATO, and Putin said nothing and did nothing. And he's done that over and over. And then the other thing is like when the US gave HIMARS to Ukraine, and Putin was making vague threats about whatever he'd do if the US gave HIMARS to Ukraine. And then eventually the US did give a few, just very few to start with, HIMARS systems to Ukraine. And Putin then responded by saying that he destroyed a whole lot of HIMARS systems. It turned out to be wooden decoys that were built by the Ukrainians, but he claimed to have destroyed more HIMARS systems than they'd sent. And so those are the two things. He'll either claim that they're useless or he'll do nothing. In this case, I don't quite see how you can claim it's useless, so he'll probably do the other option, just not say anything. So then just to say this, the background legal situation is very, very clear. Ukraine as the defender, so this is defined in international law relative to the international borders of a country. So it's become very clear since the UN Charter. So if a country crosses your border and tries to take some of your border or attacks you across the border of your defined border of your country, then they are the invader. And they don't have the right to do that. And you have the protected right of self-defense to defend against them. So you do have the right to fire back at them. So Ukraine, it's very, very clear. Ukraine has the right to fire at its attacker and do whatever it can by way of defensive operations to try and prevent the attacker from attacking it. So that would include even attacking factories that are making missiles that Russia is firing at Ukraine, or firing at fighter jets and helicopters on airfields in Ukraine in Russia, where Russia is flying them daily into Ukraine. All that is protected, that's safe. Ukraine has every right to do that. Or destroying fuel dumps or munition dumps. Anything that Russia is using to attack Ukraine is legitimate target for Ukraine in international law. And Russia has no legitimate targets in Ukraine. That's a simple legal situation. So That's the background situation. Then Putin just makes up these red lines. They're nothing to do with international law. So now, if I look at this situation, then this is an example. So this is, let's just go and look. This is Frontline Kudvirka, or however you pronounce that. And this is a disputed area that Russia is trying to take. And so I don't know where the tanks are, where the defenders are, but just suppose, for an example, this would be a very natural place. That's a road that crosses the border into Ukraine in peaceful times. And that would be just inside the Russian border. Russia could position a tank there. So I imagine that, just to explain how this all works. And then Ukrainian soldiers are positioned there. They would even be positioned there, just the other side on the field. But suppose they're here along this road. Then Russia, its modern T-90 tanks, they can fire 7 to 8 rounds a minute. So every minute they're getting 7 to 8 shells, and they could be firing them directly at the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians here, up until Biden made this change in his instructions to Ukraine, they could fire as many shells as they like in this ploughed field in Ukraine. They couldn't fire anything across the border into this wood because it's in Russia. So the Ukraine could just drive a tank up to the border and then start firing shells over there, and they know that that Ukraine can never fire back at them. And that was Putin's bizarre red line. And that was Biden's instruction to Ukraine: you must not fire over the border with your shells. And so but the United States come up with this funding. Congress didn't make this rule. Biden made this rule for Ukraine. Congress has been telling Biden, please drop this rule, it doesn't make any sense. And the only reason Biden is doing it is because Putin told him, not because Congress told him. And so Biden has now said he's not going to follow Putin's instructions on this matter. And he is going to permit Ukraine to fire shells over the border into Russia, so long as the tank there is firing at Ukraine, or Ukraine has clear evidence they're about to start firing. So Russia can still move as many tanks as like. It could have 100 tanks all lined up there. As long as they haven't started firing, Ukraine can do nothing, according to Biden's new order. But as soon as they start firing at Ukraine, or getting ready to fire, Ukraine can then fire back at them. So that's his new order. And the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, you remember how much he delayed this bill, but he was one of the many people telling Biden, you should just drop all restrictions, just allow Ukraine to do everything that it is legally permitted to do as a country that is defending itself. That's the sensible thing to do. So, for instance, it's legally permitted, as I was explaining, legally permitted to hit an airfield with fighter jets, where the fighter jets are flying every day to drop bombs on Ukraine. Then that's a legitimate defensive target, and there's no reason why the ATACMS shouldn't be used to attack that, just as they're used to attack a similar airfield if it's in occupied Ukraine. So that would be the normal situation. That is what the UK has told, and 10 countries have done various different variations on this, and some, like Poland and the UK, just say, just as long as you're using it according to the UN Charter for defensive purposes, you can use our weapons however you like. And that is what you would normally expect in a war. And so, but Biden is very, very cautious. And Olaf Scholz in Germany is another one who's like that, extremely cautious. And Italy is another one like that. They just will not approve anything until they've seen several other NATO countries doing it and nothing happening, essentially. So anyway, so Biden has now permitted the Ukrainians, so they can now fire back across the border, and this will make a huge difference. So this shows how it was until just a day or two ago. And just a little bit more detail. This is the Google Street View. So you can imagine the tank was positioned there. And this is the street at the other side where the Ukrainian soldiers could be. Ukrainian soldiers would be there. There'd be tanks there firing shells, 7 or 8 a minute, landing in this road. And Ukraine has to fire their shells there, in that ploughed field. They can't target that wood because it's in Russia. That was the situation until Biden changed those instructions. And this is that's just 700 meters away, and this is with a howitzer as a range of 30 kilometers. They'd have to stop it down to just short of 700 kilometers or fire it into that field a little bit further away, so as to make sure they only hit targets in Ukraine. It never made any sense. That's all that Biden's done, and people are making a big fuss about it. This is just a showing it somewhat larger scale, so you can see that's where I've imagined the Ukrainian soldiers defending, and that's not a possibility for the tank, either there, or it could drive into that, maybe there in the very corner of that wood, and then fire from there. And you could have a tank there and a howitzer there, and the howitzer wouldn't be able to fire back at it. So that was the bizarre situation. And here's Jens Stoltenberg, and he explained that if you don't give Ukraine permission to fire weapons over the Russian side of the front line, make it far harder for Ukraine to defend itself, and self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter. It is legal and legitimate, and NATO allies are helping Ukraine to uphold that right. Now, this is now just slightly rephrased, so that is rephrasing that bit, which is slightly more words, so I just slightly shortened his sentences and put them in bullet points to make it a bit easier to read what he said. And especially for autistic people, find putting it in points like this very helpful, and somewhat simpler, straight, more contained sentences. So that's what he said. And now I just want to talk here about, I've got to change that to 10 days, I haven't done it yet. So you've got these news stories that some of the scared people are talking about, and they get the impression that Russia is doing a huge advance across Ukraine, and that soon Kharkiv city is going to fall, and then before long after that, that Kiev and Odessa, and that Russia will take over all of Ukraine. Far, far from it. So, because of this bizarre rule, then Russia was able to advance in just a few days, advance that far, because that entire area, Ukraine was not able to lay minefields. It wasn't able to dig trenches, build fortifications, or anything like that, because if they tried, they'd be under constant fire from Russia with their 7 or 8 shells a minute. So Ukrainian front lines are set back 10-12 kilometers from the front line here. So about that distance. So I think even there is probably not quite at the Ukrainian, their front line of defences, I mean. So they'd have multiple lines of defences, and the front line would be probably around there. This shows the distance. This is how close Russia would have to be to start dropping shells on Kharkiv city, that circle there. So as to give you an idea. So they're not very far away from it, but Ukraine will have defences somewhere around there. And now this is just to show what's happened in the last 10 days, from the 19th to the 29th. So if you look very closely there, look where the V is, there's a slight change in the position of the Russian front line. There's slightly more change there. See? And it's maybe a kilometre, 2 kilometres. If you look at the second page, it shows how big a kilometre is. So that was maybe a couple of kilometres or something, 2-3 kilometres. And Ukraine has got an area, has managed to liberate an area 2-3 kilometres by maybe a kilometre or so. Then they're not really a slightly larger area that Russia's got. This is with Ukraine essentially fighting with their hands behind their back because they can't fire their howitzers, which have a range of 30 kilometres. So the howitzer range is that much in this scale. You know, they could fire way up here somewhere with their howitzers, but they were only permitted they had to stop them down. And look, this is where I had that imaginary thing with the tank there somewhere, and the Ukrainians there, and they just wouldn't be able to fire over the border there. So that's why it's very safe. There's no way that Putin's going to do anything, and I'll talk a little bit more now about why Putin won't do anything. But first of all, I just want to say a couple of other things, I think. So first of all, some of you have got a very mistaken idea. So you heard the news that, obviously in the news, that Russia keeps targeting civilians in Ukraine. And the New York Times, it ran this picture with a very misleading caption. It said this was the result of a Ukrainian attack on Belgorod. It was not. This is far, Ukraine doesn't even have anything it's firing at Russia, that would be able to do something like this. This is a big, big bomb. And the open source intelligence, they say, and it approached from the Russian side, approached the apartment from the Russian side. Now, it's not Russia attacking its own civilians, it's not that. It's just that ever since 2022, ever since the war started, not long after it started, we started getting these stories about the Russian bombers dropping bombs in Russia. Just accidentally, they fall off their planes. And it's not very, I haven't yet managed to find an explanation of why it happens. So, I mean, I'm sure people know, but I haven't managed to find out. Whether it's the pilots pressing the wrong button, or whether it's badly maintained bombers, but it's been happening all the way through the war. And this was an example where clearly this was a bomber that intended to drop this glide bomb on Kharkiv city probably, or somewhere in Ukraine. And it fell off the plane above Belgorod while it was flying over. And the Russians, they didn't want to acknowledge that one of their own planes had done this, so they blamed Ukraine. And then what happened is that Getty Images got hold of this image, and they licensed it to the New York Times, and the caption they put on it was taken from the Russian, maybe from their source, maybe they got it from a Russian source, but it was Russian propaganda, and they just put it on as is. And the New York Times didn't bother to check, and they just used the same caption, shortened for their article. And as there was a lot of commentary as soon as that article came out. It was all over Twitter, the experts that I follow, talking about how shoddy this journalism was to show something like this, when just very quickly open source intelligence had worked out that it was a Russian glide bomb that had been dropped by accident. And the New York Times had never tried to check that. So that is a very shoddy journalism. It's understandable, people in a hurry, but they haven't issued a correction, they haven't corrected their image. It's still there, last time I checked. And there's nothing there to tell you that this was actually a Russian bomb. Near certainty. I mean, the Ukrainians just couldn't do that. They haven't got anything that would do that. I mean, look at how big it must have been in the bomb. It must have been a massive bomb. So, and then if the other thing to be aware of is that Ukraine keeps very carefully to the UN Charter itself. It wants to make sure that it does not become an illegal invader. And it needs to be careful because of support of the allies and just to be in the right on this. So the UN always stops at the Ukrainian border. And this is also important when I get to talking about NATO towards the end of this video, that the NATO is a defensive treaty, and the defense stops at the border of NATO. In the same way, Ukraine's defense stops at the border of Ukraine. And they will not they will not try and take even a meter of Russian territory. So if you're used to reading old stories about wars like the 1812, the war between Canada and the United States, and they took back bits of each other's territory back and forth. But in a modern war, when a country is defending, they will stop at their border, at the international border, which they can locate with GPS, and they can put in, and this is them putting in a border post in May 2022 when they got back to the Ukrainian border. That is their objective. So there's no risk to Russia, and Putin knows this perfectly well. He can see all these border posts that the Ukrainians popped up, and they have never crossed the Ukrainian. They've never tried to push the border posts a little way into Russian territory. They just don't do that. So Putin knows this war is over if he withdraws all his soldiers from occupied Ukraine. That is the Ukraine's objective, and they're not going to attack Russia. They're not going to attack Moscow. And Putin knows that full well. And then this is about why Pedro. So now we're going to talk about how Russia will not attack UK or NATO. So I'm going to explain a little bit more detail about this. But first of all, Admiral Radakin, then he said the biggest reason that Putin doesn't want a conflict with NATO is because Russia will lose, and lose quickly. And this, he talks about that in the talk that is taken from. And he talks about how that the NATO countries, that would be including himself, had no idea how weak Russia was until they tried to invade Ukraine. And a particular striking example was with the Air Force. So Russia has 10 times, so I'm giving some details that's not in his talk, but that I know from other sources. So Russia has 10 times as many military aircraft and 10 times as many fighter jets as Ukraine. And for most of 2022, Ukraine had almost no air defences except the Stinger, which was only for very low-flying aircraft and helicopters. And the NATO countries confidently expect, people writing about it, I read about it from experts before the war started to help scared people. And these experts were saying, well, one thing we can be sure of is that Russia will take over the Ukrainian airspace very early in the war. And that never happened. So they were just saying, well, look, they've got so many military aircraft, so many fighter jets. The first thing that Putin is going to do if he attacks, even if he's only aiming to take a small part of Ukraine, is that he'll spend a day or two just destroying all the Ukrainian aircraft on the ground. And then he'll do that before he sends anyone in. But he didn't. He only did that for an hour or two. And that gave time, there's lots and lots of evidence all the way through the war that Putin is utterly incompetent as a military leader. He doesn't have a clue. And he overrides his generals. His generals probably have given him better advice, but he just says, go do this, and they have to do it. So the Ukrainian pilots, they got into the MiG-29s, they went flying off, and they landed, and the MiG-29, it's got an air breather on the top instead of underneath. So this means it can land on a road, on a highway that hasn't been prepared in any way. Even if it's all covered in leaves and covered in twigs, a MiG-29 can land on it and then take off again. And none of that gets caught in its exhaust. So the Ukrainians, mostly with MiG-29s, ancient Soviet, but very robust and capable, but nowhere near the match of the modern fighter jets. And that's mainly what Ukraine has. And Ukraine used that. They just dispersed to the highways throughout Ukraine. And then they built temporary airstrips all over Ukraine. And then it was impossible for Putin to destroy them with missiles. So that's what happened in the early days of the war. And then after that, again, everyone was confidently expecting with 10 fighter jets to 1, surely Russia is going to take over the airspace, even with them dispersed like that. But it didn't happen. And that's when they discovered that Russian pilots have never trained in those kind of operations. The only operations they've trained in is point to point, just flying to a place, dropping a bomb, and going back again, following the orders of their commander. The pilots they're not trained in independent decision making either. So if they see something, they won't divert from their route. They'll ask their commander, should I drop a bomb on that convoy, say? And the commander will then tell them whether to or not. They're just not used to making their own decisions. Whereas the the Ukrainian pilots are much more independent. They're trained in that because when Russia invaded Crimea, then Ukraine, it didn't get any military technology support from NATO, but it started getting training from them. And UK, as we'll see, UK has got a special connection, and the United States with Ukraine. We'll see why in a minute. And so they got training from those countries, and they did joint exercises with NATO. And so they learnt a lot about modern piloting, which the Russians haven't learnt yet. And so the Ukrainian pilots, they clearly are far, far better than the Russian pilots, because they managed to keep them out. Within just a few weeks, they had control of the Ukrainian airspace. And Lviv has been very safe because of this. Otherwise, Russia would have had control of the airspace over the whole of Ukraine. They would just be able to fly over Lviv and drop bombs on it before the Patriots. But no, because the Ukrainian very small air force, maybe 50 or so planes, fighter jets, held off 10 times as many because they're better pilots. So that was an example that he gave, although he didn't go into that much detail. And Russia is both NATO has got a vast number of fighter jets. It's not. I don't know if it's got more than. I think it probably has got more than Russia, but they're much more modern. That's the most important thing. We'll come to that in a minute. And there's just no way that Putin wants to get in a conflict with a country like NATO, because he'd lose very quickly. And so I'll come into that a bit more in a bit. So Putin knows this full well. Putin is not. He's not foolish in that sense. So Putin has not. It's very clear that Putin has no plan whatsoever of attacking NATO. He's never going to do it. It's not even a moment of thought to that. He hasn't got any planning for that, because if Putin was prepared for war with NATO, well, his top priority would be to protect Moscow, obviously. And he would preserve the 1st Guard Tanks Regiment, the tanks army, which was both to protect Moscow and to protect Russia generally against NATO. And they had about 500 modern tanks and stationed in Moscow. And as soon as the Ukraine war started, he sent that entire army into Ukraine, leaving Moscow undefended. And this army, it didn't actually do that well in Ukraine. It actually lost a lot of its tanks, a lot of its soldiers, and by the time it got to September 2022, then the UK intelligence, its assessment was that Russia's conventional force designed to counter NATO is severely weakened, especially during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, when Ukraine took back a large area of Kharkiv, and a little bit later with Izium, but it was already just, was that after? I think it was. I'm forgetting the order of it now. But anyway, I followed it at the time, but I've forgotten now because that's 2 years ago now. But he just gradually lost. Basically, the 1st Guard Tank Army, he lost a lot of his best people there in it, and he lost a lot of its equipment, and it's essentially no longer functional. And the UK Defence Intelligence said that it'd be years for them to recover the capability they had to defend against NATO in February 2022. And one of the clearest examples of this is for the last 2 victory parades, which Russia has in Moscow on 9th of May, and in 2023, this is the 2023 one, they had only 1 tank, which they always have, and this is a T-34 World War II tank, and that always leads the parade. But normally they have lots of modern tanks behind it. But Ukraine didn't even have one modern tank to follow behind it, because they're all in Ukraine fighting. And any new tanks, they go straight to Ukraine. So Putin is pretty much defenseless against NATO. This is just one of many things. He also moved nearly all his air defenses. So this is why you keep getting these stories about how Ukraine it just sends these really quite primitive drones, which fly about the same speed as a World War II Spitfire. And they're slow enough so that the Russians, with their mobile phones, they can just film them going over. But the Russians can't stop them because their air defenses are in Ukraine. And there are huge gaps in them, and Ukraine just weaves their drones through them and then hits things. So Russia is not going to start a war with NATO. So it just doesn't make sense that Putin is certainly not preparing for a war with NATO. And the other very clear thing is that he's moved nearly all his soldiers that used to be stationed in Kaliningrad and along the very long border with NATO, and he's moved them into Ukraine to fight in the war in Ukraine, leaving that pretty much defenseless. Just all Putin relies on is his nuclear deterrent, which only works as a deterrent if you don't use it. If you use nukes, then NATO's top priority will be to make sure that Putin doesn't fire anymore. And so we'll get into a little bit more. Actually, NATO is vastly superior to Russia. I haven't quite given an impression yet of quite how superior it is. There's a lot more to come. So, and then people just always say, but what about the Ukraine war? Now, almost everyone, the US were the main ones who were saying that they thought Putin would invade. And the main reason other people said he wouldn't is because it was obvious that he wasn't going to be able to win quickly. But Putin, it turned out, had got false information. His spies were telling him the wrong stuff. He believed that the Ukrainian generals would quickly switch over to Russia as long as he was to very quickly send lots of soldiers to Hostomel airport and then drive into Kiev, and he was expecting them to just cheer him on and say, okay, we'll join you and help you take over Ukraine. He didn't really understand Ukraine very well, and he thought that he would be able to take over Ukraine within a few days to a week, maybe a week or two. So that was why he invaded Ukraine. This wasn't his plan. He didn't have a plan B, he just then improvised after that. He thought he had a cunning plan to win quickly, and he prepared for it carefully. He had these big massed movements in 2021 and then again in 2022, and presumably during that time he had intelligence people giving him information about what Ukraine was doing and feeding him false information because he wasn't listening to the people who were telling him the truth, probably. And then he said, right, now's the time and we'll go in. And that's why they ran out of fuel. It was the wrong season for an attack with too much mud, so the tanks were stuck on the roads, because he wasn't expecting it to be a proper war. Everything else was just a distraction for this cunning plan to quickly take over Kiev, which didn't happen. So that was a plan of a ruthless, overconfident, but basically rational man who thought he had a cunning plan. He's not very good at military thinking, but he thought he was better at military thinking than he is, and so overconfident. And so that's what happened with Ukraine. But now, planning to attack NATO without any preparation, having moved all his defences a lot of his defence into Ukraine, having moved all the tanks from Moscow into Ukraine. And we can confirm, because when Wagner, in the spring of 2023, when they had that driving, you remember all in the news, them driving up the main road to Moscow, and they had some tanks in their convoy carried on their trucks. And Putin didn't have a single tank to bring out onto the streets of Moscow to meet them. So, and that confirms what we also see in the Red Square parade, that Moscow literally has no tanks left. They're all in Ukraine. So this is someone who is not in the right. He's not prepared for NATO. It's very opposite. It's very clear he is very confident NATO is not going to try to attack Russia, despite whatever he might say by way of propaganda. So, and Russia is very much at its weakest. It's very, very weak now. You know, it lost its first class tank army, but it's lost a couple of its airborne command stations, and it's lost a lot of its air defences. Every week, one or two of them nowadays seems to be destroyed by ATACMS, and often the most modern S-400s. And he's lost a quarter of his Black Sea fleet, and he keeps losing more ships, and keeps losing more fighter jets, and these airborne command stations, and he's losing so many tanks. He's lost at least 3,000. Ukraine say 7,000, over 7,000. Open source intelligence has a photograph of each one. They have photographs of 3,000. The 7,000 may well be an overestimate, but at least 3,000 tanks. And they're only able to make 1,500 a year, so they're just barely keeping pace. And most of those are reconditioned old Soviet ones. They make much fewer. I'm not sure, a few dozen a month or something. I've got the figures somewhere. So Russia it's used up its stocks of Soviet shells. I mean, it's now doing reconditioned old Soviet shells, and it can only produce so many of those a year, and it's relying on shells from North Korea of all places. So this is not. Russia is very, very weak now, and it would take it years to get back to, maybe even a lot longer than years, maybe even a decade or two, to get back to its capability in 2022. And for him, for him to attack now would be totally dim, incoherent plan by a man who's lost his capability for coherent thought. You'd have to be delusive. You'd have to be at the level where perhaps he thinks Ukraine's being attacked by skyscraper-sized spiders or something. And there's no sign that Putin's anything like that. And his generals wouldn't obey him if he went completely mad and doolally, as they say. So, no, that's not what's going on. So, do you see a difference between the invasion of Ukraine and this idea of a plan to attack NATO? He clearly can't have a plan to attack NATO. Hope you agree. So, meanwhile, he gets constant feedback that his bluffs work. So, just using words, then he managed to delay HIMARS for quite a long time in 2022. He delayed the Patriot air defences to spring 2023. He delayed the modern tanks until spring 2023. He delayed the MiG-29 fighter jets through most of 2022, and the fights, and Poland even supplying it with Soviet-era tanks. He delayed that too. He just through using words, and for a very obvious reason, he bluffs, because that gives Ukraine a disadvantage and makes it harder for Ukraine to fight back. That's the only reason he bluffs. And then, as soon as the bluff fails, he then just does another bluff about something else. He just ignores the one that failed. And he just does that over and over. And this is about the difference between first of all, just want to say a little bit about Ukraine has 900,000 soldiers, and people look at that and they say, well, look, Russia's 1.32 million, and Russia's a bigger population, it's more than 3 times the size of Ukraine. Say, well, clearly Ukraine hasn't got enough soldiers. But if you look at it a bit more carefully, that's just a little over 2% of the Ukrainian soldiers. That's less than 1% of the Russian. So Russia could ramp up, but it doesn't want to, because it's not an important war to most Russians. And Putin wants to keep it that way, because they're going to get very dissatisfied if they're forced to fight in this war, which they don't really understand what it's all about. They're only doing it as a patriotic duty, not because they believe in it or think that there's any real risk to Russia. And then US defense spending is vastly higher than what Russia has. and NATO defence allies, the European allies, and the two together is over $1 trillion a year, and Russia is about 1/10 of that. And so that is why the Russian technology is so feeble. So I just want to talk about the fighter jets again. So this US and NATO fighter jets, NATO has 400 of these F-35s, USA and Europe has 100 plus. That's about 500 of them. And the F-35 is, so take the F-16 and with retrofitted radar technology to stealth technology, then the F-16, which is 1970s technology, then its radar cross-section, so what it looks like in a radar, it's bigger than a bird, it's about half the size of a door in radar cross-section. That's the F-16, which is a stealth, but quite an ancient and upgraded. They call it 3.5, I think, when they upgraded. The F-35 has the same radar cross-section as a large potato. No, not as big as that, but the size of a big potato. The biggest size potato that you can buy in the shops. Then, essentially, that's what the radar has to try to look out for. It's a supersonic potato flying through the sky. And as you can imagine, that's much harder to spot than a supersonic, half the size of a door-sized thing. And so this an F-35 fighter jet pilot, then he said it's like your fighter jet is invisible. It's like playing an invisible game of football. And he reckons that if Ukraine had F-35s, he said that this is not going to happen, but if he was ordered, so all of the fighter jets were ordered to go into Ukraine, they could take over the Ukrainian airspace very quickly, just a matter of hours. And then all the occupied territory would be controlled by the F-35s. And then from the air, they can shoot out the radar on the ground. And then and the radar wouldn't be able to see them, and they destroy any fighter jets that come their way before the fighter jets can see them, because they just look like a supersonic potato. And so that shows how vastly superior NATO is. And the big question for Ukraine is really, how much of this vastly superior technology does NATO decide to give to Ukraine? In principle, suppose that NATO decided we're not not going to be bothered by Putin's bluffs at all, then they would have said back in 2022, well, we'll just give them a few F-35s and then they'll win the war very quickly. And then they'd say, and lots of ex-F-35 fighter jets pilots around who would be able to volunteer, and they just join as volunteer fighters, nothing to do with us. And just say to Ukraine, and you can employ ex-F-35 fighter jets. The F-35 fighter jets in many countries supplied by the United States. So the United States wouldn't need to send anyone. And then some of those ex-fighter pilots would be able to travel to Ukraine. They say, look, I want to volunteer. And their personal risk would be very low, actually, because it's almost invisible fighter jet. And they'd say, well, look, I want to go and help you fight. And then the war would likely have been over pretty quickly. And then another way that the war could be over very quickly is if they were to give them the Tomahawk cruise missile, which has got a range of 2,400 kilometers, and it's got a similar payload to ATACMS, but it could hit anywhere in the Black Sea from Ukraine, from the liberated area of Ukraine. And before long, and we've seen how the Russian ships are just defenseless against ATACMS, and before long there wouldn't be any Russian Black Sea fleet left. And then if they had the F-35s too, before long there wouldn't be any radar systems left over or air defense systems over the occupied area of Ukraine, and the tanks would be just vulnerable from above. So this shows just how very quickly the war could be won, and this is why Putin keeps bluffing. He knows this, and the only way he can prevent this from happening is by using his bluffs, just by using words. He just has to keep bluffing and say, if you send this to Ukraine, then we'll escalate. And then, so this is to help you to see. So NATO is like, Putin's like, he's just like blowing soap bubbles with his bluffs, because the countries like Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, they're very used to these bluffs. He's been doing that for years, long before the invasion. And they know he's not going to do anything. They're just very experienced, and gradually NATO is beginning to realize that. But they're just extremely timid. And I'm not saying they're wrong to be timid, but they just are. And so when you start, and then it's because the NATO countries start worrying when they cross the red lines, and then this gets and the press magnifies that. But from Putin's side, he's just bluffing, and there's no way he's going to do anything. He's just using his bluff, and then as soon as they cross the red line, he says nothing, and then starts another bluff. And this has worked for 2 years for him, so he's going to keep doing it, obviously, for as long as he can. And that's basically what he has to do in order to avoid losing the war and losing it very quickly. He just has to keep bluffing and bluffing and bluffing over and over again. It's the only way he can keep fighting. So that's why Putin does these bluffs, not because he's going to attack NATO, which he obviously is not going to. It's just so that he won't lose the war and try to keep fighting. And then I was just going to explain about the Ukrainian soldiers. I said they've got a little bit over 2%. Well, if you go back to World War II, then the United Kingdom, 24% of the male population, a bit over, so about 12% of the total population were fighting in the war. So were conscripts. So Ukraine, with its 2%, is a sixth of the level that it would do if it was really all-out war. So Ukraine, it's certainly more towards all-out war than Russia is, with 2% instead of 1% fighting. But it's nowhere like the UK was at the end of World War II. So when people say that, oh, Ukraine, they need lots of, NATO has to go there to fight, they don't. Ukraine would very much welcome if NATO was to go there in support roles, to do things well behind the front line, because that would free Ukrainian soldiers to fight on the front line. And they're more experienced soldiers that could fight better, and they have to rotate in and out and so on, and they need to be working on the back line as well. So that's why Zelensky says things like that. But they've got plenty of people. They've got plenty of young men and older men. Indeed, they don't go down to age 18, which is the normal age for conscription. They start conscription at 25, which used to be 27. And they do that so as to keep it as much as possible like peacetime, so that everyone can up to age 25, they can do their degrees, their college degrees, their university degrees, they can do their training, whatever. They can do whatever's needed to learn how to be a professional in whatever field that they're in, or be an expert or whatever it is, or farmer or whatever it is. Farming, you go to college. Farmers nowadays usually go to college, that sort of thing. And just see so they can do whatever they need to do before eventually they then do what they're going to settle down to do. And so that's basically what's going on there, is that Ukraine is trying as far as possible to maintain its peacetime economy for after the war is over, and to keep it running while the war is continuing. So that's what's going on. And so yes, if Ukraine needed more than 900,000 soldiers, it could get it from its own soldiers. It doesn't need NATO. So, and we hope that helps with that, which people sometimes worry about. And yeah, this is about the legal situation. So, this is a kind of very important thing. NATO countries do not support Ukraine under NATO. It's nothing to do with NATO. It's NATO countries that happen. That just about everyone in NATO wants to help Ukraine, but it's not a NATO. It's not a NATO thing. The individual countries are each supporting Ukraine under UN Charter 51, and this is what I was talking about. Nothing shall impair the inherent right of individual self-defense if an armed attack occurs, until the Security Council has taken the measures necessary. And of course, Russia is a permanent member of the Security Council. It just constantly vetoes any attempt to take measures to stop the war. So the UN Security Council can't intervene, and so therefore Ukraine has the inherent right of collective or individual collective self-defense until whenever the Security Council can do anything, which is never. So that means always. Ukraine, just until the war is over, Ukraine has that right, according to UN Charter. And it's Russia that's breaking the Charter, of course. And then the other reason legally they do it is under the Budapest Memorandum. This is 1994. And Ukraine, when it's separated out from the Soviet Union, then it gave, so it had lots and lots of nukes, and Russia, United States, and United Kingdom, they all wanted Ukraine to give up its nukes. So did Ukraine. But Ukraine worried that if it gave up its nukes, it wouldn't have, it would lose its, it would lose its self-defense, because it saw the nukes as being a kind of security thing. And so they asked for security and reassurances, and Russia, United Kingdom, and United States, all of them they promised not to invade Ukraine. They promised to help Ukraine with material support, not with their soldiers, but in other ways, if it was invaded. So Russia, of course, broke all those promises when it invaded Ukraine. But the United Kingdom and the United States, under this agreement that Russia itself signed, are committed to protecting Ukraine against Russia. So it's quite a bizarre situation. It's under a memorandum that Russia signed as an agreement principally between Russia and Ukraine, that the United Kingdom and the United States also signed. Under that memorandum, that is why United Kingdom and United States are helping Ukraine against Russia. So that's quite a bizarre situation, and that's the legal situation. That's why United Kingdom and United States are particularly vocal in this, and are particularly strong allies of Ukraine. And UK has nothing like the GDP and economy of the United States, but it does what it can. And it often is the first to offer something to Ukraine, and that's why. Because historically, UK has this commitment. So it's the first to offer the tanks, it's first to offer training for fighter jets and so on, all the way through the war. It's been very strongly supporting Ukraine because of this long-term connection and commitment. And UK had trained Ukraine after 2014. It did quite a lot of training of Ukrainian soldiers, though it didn't give anything material at that point. And the United States was the first to give Ukraine any defensive capabilities with the Javelin anti-tank missiles under Trump and then under Biden. And then the other ones, like Lithuania and Latvia, they were the first to give after that with their Stingers, and that's under the inherent right of individual collective self-defense under the UN Charter. So that's the legal situation. And now this is about why Putin will never use nukes. So this is just another thing that some of these things I'm saying here I talk about in the longer debunk, so you can go and read about them there. And this is a somewhat shorter page. So Putin, he's never going to use nukes. He only uses them rhetorically as bluffs. And so people have this cartoon idea about Putin, I think. They don't see him as being a real person, more like a cutout, like a James Bond villain or like something from a cartoons. And I think nowadays it might be also partly video games. So I don't play video games, especially I don't play the shooter video games. I used to do a little dabbling in Minecraft, just exploring the world. I didn't even do anything except travel around in it and look at it, because it's just not really my kind of thing. But I've seen people sharing themselves playing video games and so on, and they shoot them up things, and you see these enemies that are essentially insane. They're not human beings. They don't behave like human beings. And I think that may be part of what this is. That maybe people think of Putin as just being like a video character who is programmed to attack you, and who doesn't need to have any even real motivation. He's just insane. But real people aren't like that. So Putin is a real person. He's not mad. He's not a video game character. He's not a cartoon character. He's not a James Bond villain. He's a real person. And he's got very strange ideas. He's certainly very ruthless, but he has things he cares about. So I think this will also help you to realize he's never going to use nukes. So if you look at the things he cares about, so he cares about the buildings and culture and the artifacts and Russianness. He doesn't seem to have really be that bothered about individual human lives. He surely must care about his children and his girlfriend and things like that. But just as how could he be a human being and not do that? But he doesn't seem to have very much concern about if what he's doing ends up with people being killed. But he does care about Russia. And if you stop and think about it, if he wanted to just live a life of luxury or whatever, then he'd be an oligarch. He wouldn't be a president of Russia, which is a much more dangerous position to be in, even in modern Russia. I mean, I know oligarchs in some extent in some danger if they cross Putin, but if he just sort of either left Russia or just sort of had a low profile, then he wouldn't be bothered about what the president thinks about him either. Just be very careful. But he doesn't want to be an oligarch. But he does like luxury. He has the Putin Palace. He is very, very keen on Fabergé eggs, and an expert on Fabergé eggs, I think it was a podcast or something, was talking about this, and they were invited to go and see the eggs over there, and they talked to Putin, and he just wanted to talk on and on and on about the Fabergé eggs. So he can tell you lots of things about these Fabergé eggs. So these used to belong to the former Tsars. He thinks of himself as being a new Tsar. And so he's especially keen on the Fabergé eggs, which are these kind of treasures from the former Russian Empire. And so if he uses nukes, then it's going to harm Russia, it's going to harm Russianness, it's going to cause problems with Fabergé eggs or whatever it is. So no, he wouldn't be president if he didn't care, and he does care, and this is one of the things he cares about. And he'd lose everything he's been working for his entire life if he used a nuke. So no, he's not a madman who's going to invade. He's a rational but ruthless, is how one person put him. So he constantly bluffs to prevent NATO sending its weapons to Ukraine. So how would it make sense to attack NATO and guarantee that NATO will give Ukraine everything it asks for and more, and even take part in the war? That makes absolutely no sense. So he constantly bluffs that he's going to attack NATO. He is never going to attack NATO. And it's very obvious he's not preparing to do it. It's very obvious he is not going to do it. And I'm sure the advisors and the generals and the presidents and President Biden will know this intellectually. They'll be telling him this, but he has to think about his voters. He has to think about the broader picture. And generally, and same with Olaf Scholz in Germany, where the Germans are very, very, very cautious about being involved in anything military because of their history and want to distance themselves from the times of Hitler. So those are the two very, very cautious, and the United States is very, very, very cautious. And so when you start hearing these news stories, then Putin's not a cartoon villain, and NATO countries, when they're saying things which to you seem reckless, they're actually incredibly cautious and incredibly timid, and they're like this mammoth. It's like, if you go back to my picture of a mammoth, then NATO countries like a huge, huge mammoth, and they see a little midget who's blowing soap bubbles, and they're just standing there and looking at the soap bubbles and wondering if they might be dangerous. And that's essentially what's going on here. And they just don't dare to come close to this little midget blowing the soap bubbles, because just in case the soap bubbles turn out to be dangerous. And that's essentially, they're just being incredibly timid. And I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. I'm just saying that's what they're doing. And so when Biden crosses this red line very slowly, very carefully, and the Congress, Biden does, it's not Congress. Congress said, absolutely fine, don't put any restriction on these weapons. But Biden says, no, I've got to put these restrictions on. I don't feel comfortable letting Ukraine just use them according to the law of the UN Charter. We've got to add these extra conditions that they mustn't use them except in very special circumstances on Russian territory. So it's still very circumscribed what they can use them on. And then gradually over time, you'll probably gradually relax that and eventually say, oh yes, you can use the ATACMS, but so long as it's against it. And then you might give a list of targets that they can use them against. And Mike Johnson, who took so long actually passing the Ukraine bill, but he thinks this is nonsense. And he says that, the Speaker of the House, and he says Congress has not put any limits on the weapons, and we should just say to Ukraine, so long as you use them, just use them as you like, so long as it's according to UN Charter. And there's no need to have any other restriction than that. And since Ukraine does keep to the UN Charter, then, and it's going to use it only in defensive ways, then they don't need to put any restrictions. And that is the attitude of Poland, that's the attitude of the United Kingdom. And so far, the 10 countries that have said it's okay, it might be more by now. And some of them have just said no restrictions, so long as you just understood, of course, that they'd use them in defensive ways, and they wouldn't use them to try to take any territory from Russia. Then, as long as it's used like that, and not against civilians, only against military defensive targets, and so long as it's like that, then that's all. That's the only restriction that is really needed according to international law. I just want to say very quickly, I'm Buddhist, and you don't have to as a Buddhist, there are Buddhist soldiers, but I have taken the vow of not killing, and as part of that vow, my personal interpretation of that vow, and as I understood it, as taught to me, and as I interpret it, then I could not give advice. Even suppose I did have the expertise to do it, I could not give advice to any military or any leader making military decisions or making decisions about whether to supply weapons. I could never pay towards weapons for Ukraine. I couldn't advise anyone to send weapons to Ukraine or anything like that. I couldn't advise someone to join the Ukrainian, anything like that. So this is just to help people who are scared. It's not meant to be in any way, and I very much don't want any of this to be used in any way to influence any decision making. It's nothing to do with that, or in any way influence any choices about whether weapons are sent to Ukraine or not, or anything like that. This is not for that. It's just to help people who are scared, to help them to understand the situation. So I thought I'd better say that, and just make the situation clear. So just my last little bit is about, a lot of people don't understand about NATO. So this is about the NATO Charter, And this is not really, it's a little bit of a digression about what I'm talking about here, but it's kind of relevant because people worry about Putin attacking NATO, and then their assumption is they're really thinking, well, suppose Putin was to attack NATO, then you get all-out war. It's not, that's not true either. It's not going to happen. It's clear he's not going to attack NATO. But just to look at, suppose, look at the situation, if he were to attack NATO, then this would give the country right on NATO to call for collective self-defense. So it's just like with Ukraine. Ukraine, to the UN Charter, it can just defend itself. It can't invade Russia. In the same way, in NATO, under the NATO treaty, and it's consistent with international law, it is just to defend NATO countries along the NATO boundary. And there's no commitment, indeed it would be against international law for NATO countries to band together to invade into Russia. So as soon as they have stopped the invasion, that's the commitment over. And so NATO is defensive and not offensive, and it will just do whatever is needed to stop the attack. And then some people say, but perhaps Putin could just, suppose it would do very quickly, this little place called Narva, for instance, which is a little bit of Estonia. They say, well, suppose Putin was just to do that, just to be annoying and to just show what he can do. And it's basically a city and not much more than that, which is in between Russia and the Baltic Sea. And they say, well, suppose Russia were just to send a half dozen tanks and a few soldiers in there, and Estonia would probably not be able to respond quickly, and then NATO would spend ages deliberating, and then Russia would just quietly annex it and make it part of Russia. And then by the time the NATO's decide to respond, then Narva's had it as part of Russia, and it would be very difficult to win it back again. Well, it just wouldn't happen like that, because what these people don't realise is that NATO has, specifically for that exact reason, NATO has a rapid response force, which currently is 40,000. It's going to ramp up to 300,000. And if, say, Estonia was being attacked, then the first attack is not going to be hundreds of thousands, or they don't have spotted this long ago. So if they're attacked with a few tanks and a few soldiers, then just a second. No, we're out of water. Sorry, I hope that's not too noisy. So if they were to attack with a few tanks and a few soldiers, then the Estonia would then say it doesn't have much of an army itself, so it would say to the rest of NATO, we need help. And within hours, those supersonic potatoes, the F-35s, they would be there. And and there'd be a small army of, the first 20,000 would be there within a day or two, a few days. And then the rest of that 40,000 would be there, within a few more days. And that'd be a force of soldiers, pilots, ships, tanks, and so on, whatever they needed. Air defences, artillery, and so on. So they would all be there, and that would be without any need for any decisions by any of the member countries of NATO, because they've already decided and committed and said that they have committed these soldiers already. So they don't make on-the-spot decisions about that. They just immediately go. They're automatic. If they need it, they'll go there. And so very quickly, just the F-35s from above, I think those supersonic potatoes by themselves would probably be enough. And then very quickly some other soldiers coming along, and with their tanks and their howitzers and their HIMARS, and the Tomahawk cruise missiles and so on, everything that I've talked about, and all sorts of other things. And the Russians would be out there like scalded cats very quickly. So a thing like trying to take a few islands or take Narva or something, there's no way Russia's going to try that either. So, and then another thing is that people often worry, but suppose Russia was to attack, say, a NATO general or an admiral or soldiers, or this idea of them sending trainers to Ukraine, which would not be under NATO. It would be individual countries, because NATO Ukraine's not part of NATO. They say, but suppose Russia was to attack and kill say a general that was visiting in Ukraine, or these trainers or whatever, and wouldn't that then mean that NATO is now involved? No, it does not, because Ukraine is not NATO territory. The NATO treaty is not relevant here, because it's an attack on, for the purpose, you need to know Article 6, which not many people know. It's an armed attack, is deemed to include an armed attack on the territory of any of the parties or on the forces when in or over these territories. And then this other bit doesn't really apply anymore. So, and it's also, Article 5 is whatever such action is deemed necessary. So these are the two things that people don't understand and don't know. Plus that it's defensive, and there's no element, and there can't be an element of trying to attack Russia as part of it. It's just defensive operations. And so such action as it deems necessary, then this means that first of all, the country that's attacked decides what it wants to do, what it wants done. So we already saw Romania with those two drones, or whatever it was, that landed in Romania. And Romania didn't need any help from the other countries in NATO, so what it deemed necessary was nothing. So it didn't even ask for anything. It just deemed that it was necessary to improve its own air defences. So it did that. And now imagine that this something similar had happened to a very weak country like Estonia or like Lithuania, and then there was drones coming into it somehow from the war. It's not very likely. Then Lithuania would say, look, Russia is accidentally or deliberately firing lots of drones at us, which are intended for Ukraine. We need help. Then that would be Article 5 again. And then there would probably be rapidly sent Patriot air defences from other parts of NATO. They'd arrive in Lithuania or wherever it is, and then once that is good enough coverage to stop to protect Lithuania, then that's the end of the commitment under Article 5. So that is how Article 5 works. It ends as soon as the threat has been stopped, and as soon as either Russia withdraws or the missiles can't get through. Then that's the end of it, and the Article 5 process is over. And then it's also completely voluntary, apart from the response force. So the other countries then decide amongst themselves what is the best way to respond to this. And there's nothing here that is in any way automatic, except that the response force, then every country that takes part in, there's a kind of rotating element to it, the rapid response force, and there's a non-rotating part of it, which all the countries commit a certain element to it. And that is all committed, but they just do whatever is necessary to defend the country that needed help. And there's never going to be a NATO attack on Russia, no matter what Russia does to NATO. It's not about attacking, it's about defense. It's not about trying to take over Russia. So that's another thing that people just completely misunderstand so often. So I thought it'd be good to explain that. And I think that is it. And I think I already explained, I'm not sure if I did explain, that why it's got superior. Yes, I explained about I think I explained earlier on that I explained about the oligarchs, and the Russians, they have maybe a tenth of the GDP now of the rest of NATO, and they have a much smaller defense industrial base, because most of the GDP and most of the defense industrial base of former Soviet Union ended up part of NATO. Simple as that. And then NATO is very prosperous, and it's developed its very strong industry, and they don't have the oligarchs, which are siphoning a lot of the wealth out of Russia. and particularly like they siphon out wealth from some of the defence projects. And sometimes one defence project was a scandal a few years, some time back, which turned out that there was nothing there. They spent tens of millions or hundreds of millions, I can't remember, and all they had for it was an old laptop and model of a missile and various other bits and bobs, and the telephone numbers of public conveniences throughout one of the districts of Russia. It's very bizarre, but that's what they found. A lot of the telephone numbers were just public conveniences. And some oligarch had siphoned away a lot of the money that was supposed to go to this project. And that still happened. There's still corruption during the war as well. So, for instance, when the Ukrainians, when that van exploded on the Kerch Bridge, then part of the reason was because an oligarch had siphoned away some of the funding that was supposed to go to defending the Kerch Bridge. So they still have problems with that during the war too. So Russia's the problem. It's got a much weaker GDP. It's got the oligarchs siphoning off the funding, and this has been going on and it's got a much smaller defence industrial base, and it just can't keep up with NATO. And NATO it's completed its 4th generation fighter jet. It's going to complete its 5th generation. I don't know what radar cross-section that will be, given it's already the size of a potato, but apparently it's not good enough. So they're going an even more stealth fighter jet, the 5th generation one, which will be ready in 2030. And meanwhile, Russia is still struggling, and its 4th generation fighter jet is nowhere near combat ready. And they're still and so this is why the F-16s, they're roughly equivalent to the best modern fighter jets in Russia, even though they're 1970s technology with stealth retrofitted to it. So, and essentially, as I already said that bit, that really it is up to NATO how much they support. So Putin is constantly bluffing, because it's the only way to prevent NATO countries from giving Ukraine so much technology that Ukraine would very rapidly win against Russia. And that is basically why he keeps bluffing. And he's going to keep on bluffing, and he's going to keep on bluffing for as long as NATO is considering sending anything, any higher level of capability to Ukraine. And whatever it is, so once they've given the permission to use ATACMS against Russia, then they've sent the F-16s, there'll be something else they'll consider after that. It might be the Tomahawk cruise missiles or something, or maybe something else, or maybe there'll be some other capability, and Putin will bluff again and say, well, if you'd send that, I'll escalate. And so it'll continue until the war ends. So you've got to expect this. And just not get scared by it, because it's just a kind of game, and there's no way that Putin's going to really attack NATO, and NATO countries, they know that Putin's not really going to attack them, but they are democracies, and they must be seen to be very, very careful and cautious by the general public that support them, and they'll be voted out in the next election, and they've just got to be very careful and cautious, and they're extremely cautious, extremely careful. And then just to say, for those of you who don't know, if you come across this somewhere else, then if you need help or you're scared, post to our Facebook group, and be sure to look over the group rules before posting or commenting. They're very important. And so that if you try to join, you'll see them pinned to the head of the group. And there's a quick summary at the head of the most important rules at the head of the page. And then do join if you can help with fact-checking, and also if you can help with people who are scared or panicking. It's a great help sometimes. And I'll put a link to this in the video description. It'll look slightly different because I'll probably link to the Substack page, which it just gets presented a little bit better, but this is somewhat easier. This is where I first first make it because it's somewhat easier to copy and paste in, because, well, basically the main reason is because when I copy a link in, then Quora automatically turns it into the title, and that doesn't happen with Substack. So I first make it here and I copy it over to Substack if I'm going to do it in both. So I will put I'll put a link to the Substack blog post in the video description once I've copied it over, which will probably be before this is even finished uploading. So anyway, hope that helps you, and I'll upload this and then see what you make of it, and and if you've got questions and so on, you do say, and I can do some more videos if needed.